Hi there and welcome to All About Money. I'm your host, Dhruv Tikekar. And this week, against the backdrop of the UN Climate Change Conference, or COP26, we're going to be talking about the financing of the fossil fuel industry, or rather putting an end to it. That's what one rapidly growing movement over the years has been focused on, as it steers institutional investors toward fossil fuel divestment instead. Well, joining us from the US to talk about this is Amy Gray. She's a senior finance climate strategist with Stand.earth, a nonprofit environmental organization and one of the leading groups pushing for fossil fuel divestment. Amy, thanks so much for speaking to us.
Thanks for having me.
Stand.earth also maintains a database on divestment commitments made by investors over several years now. What does this divestment typically look like?
Well, over the years, I think what we're seeing now is a big change from the early years of the movement. The institutions that are committing now, like Harvard, the New York State Pension Fund, Francis Banque Postale, are really large and significant in the market. We also saw a big jump from previous years because we have added the most accurate, up-to-date asset numbers in our database among organizations that divested earlier. So those assets have, grown considerably because the stock market in general has gained value, and divested portfolios have seen market rate or better returns.
You've also got a report that you released this year detailing how impactful the movement has been, especially in recent years. The amount of assets now contributing to some form of fossil fuel divestment have been growing by huge numbers. Obviously, you attributed part of it to asset growth over there, but it's over $39 trillion now, which I think you've compared to the GDPs of like China and the US combined. How has it grown so much? You touched on a few contributing factors over there, but paint us a picture of this exponential growth that we've seen.
Yeah, I think it's, because the movement is now a market factor. Oil companies and market analysts, both say that the movement has gotten so big that it's affecting fossil fuel company profits. And the divest invest movement is absolutely having an impact. Polling shows that fossil fuel companies are losing their political power, and Wall Street has been forced to agree that the movement is making it harder for the industry to raise capital and complete new infrastructure. And that's really critical for us if we're going to succeed in limiting carbon emissions.
And obviously in the first question you touched on Harvard being a major contributor to the divestment movement, but some skeptics have actually called attention to phrasing used by Harvard in their recent divestment shift. If you don't mind, I'll just read it out really quick. That Harvard basically said that it has quote, no direct investments in companies that explore for or develop further reserves of fossil fuels. They also talked about how they had legacy investments with private equity funds. So, this does beg the question, what really constitutes divestment? Because if you're going through a private equity fund like Harvard is, or you're maintaining those relationships, there's still money that's somehow trickling down to these companies that perhaps are involved in some form of fossil fuel mining or in some part of that production chain.
Yeah, the university does have legacy investments in a number of private equity funds with holdings in the fossil fuel industry. Those indirect investments, according to Harvard, constitute less than 2% of the endowment. So the school has not made any new commitments to these limited partnerships since 2019, and says that they have no intention to do so going forward. They said their president said that the investments are in runoff mode, which will end as those partnerships are liquidated. Harvard already has committed to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions across the entire investment portfolio by 2050. Now it's really a matter of following up and making sure those things are done and holding them accountable to the commitments that they've made.
You brought up net zero by 2050. The report does touch on how some of these companies are feeling the heat from the movement, and that in a mad scramble to show that they've got something on paper, they've been touting this net zero by 2050 that they have going, which is that at some point in the next few decades they will try and limit or mitigate the problems or their involvement in fossil fuel consumption and production. Is that a play at just buying time? Say, for example, even in Harvard's case, and how does the movement approach this kind of gray commitment where you're not really sure whether companies will actually follow through in over such a long period of time?
Yeah, the problem with the whole net zero thing, our demand is to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. All institutional investors should adopt net zero plans that both immediately cut investments in fossil fuels and ensure that all other assets in their portfolio develop transition plans that have absolute emissions by 2030, consistent with science demands, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The idea of this net zero, it's the threat of climate change is a direct result of too much carbon in the atmosphere. And that follows that we must stop emitting more and even remove some of it. And this idea, it's central to the world's current plan to avoid catastrophe. And there's, a ton of suggestions on how to do that, mass tree planting, direct air capture devices, those kind of things, and if we deploy these and other so-called, carbon dioxide removal techniques at the same time as reducing our burning of fossil fuels, we can rapidly halt global warming. Hopefully around the middle of the century, we will achieve net zero. But at this point, it's a great idea in principle. Unfortunately, in practice, it really helps to perpetuate a belief in technological salvation. And it really diminishes the sense of urgency surrounding the need to curb emissions now. So we've kind of arrived at that painful realization as a society, as a civilization, that the idea of net zero has licensed a really reckless outlook on burn now, pay later approach, which has seen carbon emissions continue to soar. And it has also, accelerated the destruction of the natural world by increasing deforestation. So, our outlook on this in the movement is that it has to be immediately to cut those investments in fossil fuels.
I mean, it should come as no surprise that the movement has obviously gained tractions in countries that have strong commitments towards protecting the environment. I mean, the challenge, it would seem, would lie with countries that heavily subsidize their fossil fuel industries or whose economies are structured around oil production, for example, the OPEC. How does a divestment campaign work under those protective circumstances where there's actually protection from, a top-down infrastructure?
Yeah, when we deal with that here in the United States, where our government is heavily influenced and held in a grip by the fossil fuel industry. But, we really deploy tactics that, pressure our decision makers, to address the climate crisis. We're looking for no more subsidies for the oil and gas industry, to limit campaign funding and lobbying money from the fossil fuel industry into government. Term limits would also be helpful. It's one of those things where, you just have to use every tactic in your arsenal to influence, these governments and these decision makers who are, held in the grip of the fossil fuel industry. And it is on the decline, and it has to be. Our planet is at great risk right now. And those hit first and worst by the climate crisis are the ones to contribute to it the least. So those economies that run on fossil fuels have to be held accountable.
So the divestment campaign itself, I mean, do you account for various jurisdictions and how, their policies towards the environment, or is there a blanket sort of approach that you have towards dealing with institutional investors and their commitments to the industry?
I think, without revealing too many of our secrets,
Sure.
I think there can be, a definite blanket approach to campaigning. But also there is an individual, it's different in every local community, in every state, in every region. You really have to look at the culture and the working class, and you have to take into account that climate justice is social justice. And I think that if you deploy those tactics and you really look at the justice and equity of a just transition, then that's how you achieve and win a campaign. So, I mean, it's brand damage for these big banks and, some of these big institutions. They count on their reputation. So I think one of the, biggest tactics used by the movement is definitely brand damage.
And in terms of the release of the report itself, why time it for 2021? What led up to the release of your report?
I think the last one was in 2018, and the group of folks who had worked on that together previously, were into a new administration in the United States. COP, is going on right now. And the movement is just growing so fast. Public divestment commitments have grown by 49% in just the last 3 years. And in our database, we have 1,485 different institutions that have committed to some form of fossil fuel divestment in 71 different countries. And that's how we got to that 39.2 trillion in assets under management. But it's just the movement you keep seeing divestment commitments every couple days, every other day. Canada's largest pension fund just divested. So that's what really drove this was like, there are so many commitments and there's so much divestment and there's so much just fire behind the movement that I think this report really solidifies that the movement is working and that divestment as a tactic is one that they can't ignore.
Amy, obviously a lot more to get to, but we do have to go to a quick break. For those of you watching, stay tuned. We'll be right back.